begins with a contradiction so quiet most historians never noticed it. In the first decades of the 19th century, long before the industrial age darkened the skies, cities across the world woke to find themselves buried in fine dust. Streets in Paris needed to be cleared with shovels, courtyards in St. Petersburg filled with silt as though a river had changed course overnight. In Buenos Aires, shopkeepers opened their doors to drifts of powder that reached the thresholds like a passing storm had poured sand over the city. This material was not coarse or familiar. It was not the aftermath of a volcanic eruption that people could blame, nor the product of a desert wind. It was a pale, silty substance that settled with the evenness of snowfall. Residents described it as earth that arrived from nowhere, accumulating in corners, piling inside gutters, forming miniature dunes at the edges of buildings. What made it stranger was its reach. Reports came from cities separated by oceans, climates, and politics, all noting the same thing, all within the same narrow window of time. Municipal records speak of unexpected labour costs, clogged drainage, collapsed sections of roadway, and entire neighbourhoods needing clean-up as though floodwaters had receded and left sediment behind. Yet no such floods were recorded. No rivers had risen, no storms had carried enough material to bury metropolitan streets, and when the dust was swept away, the event vanished with it. Histories of the era barely remember it. Encyclopedias omit it. The world moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened, leaving only municipal archives, engineering logs, and a handful of perplexed journal entries to mark that something had been deeply out of place. If so many cities were buried at once, quietly and without cause, then what exactly covered the world in a blanket of fine dust no one could explain? To understand why this strange accumulation of fine sediment has slipped so easily from memory, we first have to look at how the 19th century explains itself. The early 1800s are presented as a careful, orderly chapter of human progress, a period defined by navigation, trade, political upheaval, and the early flicker of industrialization. Textbooks describe it as a time when cities expanded steadily, populations grew predictably, and nature behaved within the limits people expected. In this version of history, nothing dramatic enough to blanket multiple continents in dust is supposed to exist. The official narrative reaches for the simplest explanation. Some accounts blame seasonal winds, even when the cities in question sit far from deserts. Others suggest unrecorded storms that somehow deposited identical material in regions with entirely different weather systems. A few historians mention construction activity, although most major projects of the time did not generate enough earth to bury entire districts. The explanations vary, but they all share one quality. They ask the reader not to look too closely. When we compare these theories with the physical realities of early 19th century life, inconsistencies begin to emerge. Cities like Paris and St. Petersburg did not have the machinery to move large volumes of earth quickly. Buenos Aires did not expand at a pace that would bury itself in its own construction debris, and no surviving weather charts support a global event capable of carrying so much material over so many regions. Yet municipal logs show undeniable evidence of interruption. Street cleaning budgets spiked with little explanation. Records from European ports describe harbours briefly struggling with unusual sediment buildup. Road maintenance reports mention weeks of clearing fine particulate matter that seem to arrive without a source. What makes this more unsettling is how calmly the era treats the anomaly. There is no panic in the archives, no long-term inquiry, no attempt to document the origin of the material. The tone is almost resigned, as though the people of the time accepted a disruption that does not fit with the stable world historians draw for us today. This is where the contrast sharpens. The story the 19th century tells about itself is one of slow, comprehensible change, but the records hint at something more sudden, more disruptive, and more widespread, something that left a thin, persistent signature across roads, rooftops, and waterways. So we stand between two versions of the past, the calm account we inherited, and the quiet evidence the era left behind. Between them lies a gap large enough to hide an event that should have rewritten entire chapters of history. The first major contradiction appears in a place where records are unusually thorough, Paris in the years just after 1800. The city maintained detailed logs for everything from street sweeping to waste disposal. partly because its infrastructure was fragile, and partly because officials were obsessed with the image of a clean, orderly capital. These documents reveal something peculiar, an abrupt rise in the amount of fine, particulate material collected during routine cleaning, beginning in the winter months and continuing sporadically for years. This dust was not the soot of factories because Paris had not yet reached the industrial density that would define its later decades. Inspectors described the substance with surprising consistency. Pale, dry, and so light it behaved almost like ash, but without the smell or texture of anything that had burned. It accumulated in alleyways and courtyards, on the flat roofs of workshops, and in the recessed steps of apartment buildings. What stands out most is not the dust itself, but the way it moved. Contemporary reports mention that winds did not seem to account for its distribution. Wide boulevards received less of it than sheltered interior courts. Elevated neighbourhoods sometimes collected more dust than lower ones, contradicting how suspended material typically settles. And it arrived in amounts far greater than domestic activity could generate. Paris was crowded, but not enough to bury itself under its own footprint. Then there are the shapes. Several maintenance logs describe having to clear deposits from the tops of city walls, chimneys, and church balconies. One supervisor wrote that a layer of uniform earth covered the upper levels of the Hôtel Dieu hospital after a period without rain, as if the material had fallen from above rather than blown in from the streets. Another report near the Ile de la Cité noted drifts forming along parapets, collecting like sand at the edge of a shoreline. These descriptions raise immediate questions. If the dust arrived by wind, why did it accumulate most heavily in sheltered areas? If it came from human activity, why was it found on high architectural surfaces that few people ever reached? If it were natural seasonal material, why did it not match the composition of any known soil from the surrounding region? The contradiction grows sharper when we consider the amount. Paris collected far more fine sediment in these years than the city typically recorded even during major floods. Yet no flooding occurred. No river overflowed its banks. The Seine remained stable, and there were no rainfall events capable of carrying this volume of silt into the city. Imagine walking through these streets in the early morning, stepping onto cobblestones coated with a thin, pale layer of dust that had not been there the night before. Rooftops powdered like snow, church spires holding a fringe of material that should have blown away in the wind. Paris tells us something happened, something physical, visible, and large enough to demand weeks of labour. But the official narrative offers no cause. This is the first crack in the timeline, and through it, the 19th century begins to look less stable than we were taught. If the Paris anomaly feels like a localised puzzle, the second contradiction removes any comfort that this was a regional oddity. For this, we look to St. Petersburg in the same era, a city built on marshland, frozen rivers, and carefully managed canals, where the movement of earth was tracked with meticulous precision. The Russian Empire depended on accurate records to maintain transportation routes, drainage systems, and defensive works. These documents, like those of Paris, reveal a period of sudden and unexplained accumulation of fine sediment across urban districts. Unlike Paris, however, St. Petersburg was no stranger to silt. The Neva River carried enormous amounts of suspended material, depositing it seasonally along embankments and shallow waterways. But the dust that appeared in the early 19th century did not behave like river sediment. It arrived even during periods of stable river flow. It settled in patterns inconsistent with water transport, and it showed up in quantities too large to attribute to routine deposition. City officials recorded layers of powder collecting in architectural recesses, stairwells, and upper floor balconies. The Admiralty District reported a build-up on rooftops thick enough to require sweeping by maintenance crews, an unusual expense noted explicitly in city financial archives. In some years, the material interfered with drainage, clogging the narrow channels designed to capture snowmelt during the spring thaw. What unsettles historians is the timing. The build-up occurred in winters when the river was frozen solid, meaning no hydraulic transport was possible. Yet buildings on the western side of the frozen Neva, far from any source of exposed soil, collected drifts of fine, pale matter that residents had no explanation for. A letter from a naval officer describes a quiet veil of earth upon the city, falling without storm as though the air had carried a distant land across the sky. This statement hints at something profoundly abnormal. There were no recorded dust storms in the region. No desert winds reached St. Petersburg. No volcanic eruptions occurred in proximity or time frame to account for consistent deposition. The city's own engineers rejected local explanations. Their calculations showed that the volume of material collected during these years exceeded what could have been produced by construction, erosion, or agricultural disturbance. In some neighbourhoods, the build-up resembled the aftermath of river recession, except that the river never rose. And then, the oddest detail emerges. Certain courtyards and alleyways collected significantly more dust in sheltered areas than in open ones, mirroring the Paris pattern. This inversion contradicts every known model of wind deposition. Material that should have blown away settled deeply. Spots that should have collected the most remained nearly clean. When two major cities separated by nearly 1,500 miles show the same improbable characteristics, coincidence becomes difficult to defend. St. Petersburg forces us to confront a possibility the official narrative ignores, that this was not a regional disturbance nor an atmospheric quirk, but the sign of a larger phenomenon operating beyond normal weather, beyond local geography, and beyond the explanations offered by 19th century science. The world was experiencing something it could not name. When historians encounter unexplained sediment in the 19th century record, they usually turn to the same short list of explanations: seasonal winds, agricultural disturbance, increased construction, minor flooding. Each of these is presented calmly, confidently, and with the assumption that the problem is simple and the archives are exaggerating. The mainstream position is not dismissive, only certain. It proposes that cities occasionally accumulate dust, and that the event is only strange because modern readers are unfamiliar with the variations of a pre-industrial landscape. But when we hold these explanations against real-world constraints, the certainty dissolves. Seasonal winds, for example, cannot account for the scale described. The material collected in Paris and St. Petersburg did not match known regional soils. If wind were the cause, the composition should reflect nearby terrain. Instead, both cities reported sediment that seemed foreign to their surroundings. Paris received pale, fine silt, unlike the darker soils of the Seine basin. St. Petersburg documented deposits not consistent with Nava sediment, which was coarser and richer in organic content. Construction offers little help. Urban development in the early 1800s was too slow, too manual, and too localized to produce enough particulate material to bury entire districts. Even the most ambitious projects of the era, such as Parisian canal expansions or Russian naval works, lacked the machinery to generate the volume documented. Hand tools, wheelbarrows, and carts cannot produce the equivalent of a citywide dustfall. Agricultural disturbance collapses under geography. Neither Paris nor St. Petersburg sits adjacent to vast ploughed plains capable of sending enormous quantities of dust into the air, and Buenos Aires, which reported similar events, was surrounded in that era by wetlands and grassland, not the dry, loose soil necessary for dust storm formation. Flooding also fails. A flood cannot deposit sediment when no flood occurred. Paris had no unusual hydrological events during the years of highest accumulation. St. Petersburg's records show a stable river, and Buenos Aires documented no surges capable of carrying silt into the city. The deeper contradiction comes from patterns of deposition. Dust storms produce gradients. They leave thick deposits on the windward edges of structures and almost none in sheltered recesses. Yet the 19th century events show the opposite. Material collected most heavily where wind should not reach, inside courtyards, on inward-facing surfaces, and on rooftops shielded from prevailing gusts. Even more troubling is the global timing. Mainstream explanations assume local causes, but the phenomenon appears across continents within a narrow range of years. Local causes do not synchronize themselves between Europe and South America, nor do they distribute identical material across climates, cultures, and political borders. What remains is a set of explanations that work only when examined from far away. Once we look closely, the pieces slide out of place. The 19th century dust accumulation cannot be neatly attributed to the mechanisms historians prefer. The scale is too large. The timing is too aligned. The physical evidence contradicts the models. Something happened that does not fit, and because it does not fit, it has been quietly set aside. Once we step outside Europe, the quiet consistency of the phenomenon becomes impossible to ignore. Across the Atlantic, municipal records from Buenos Aires describe a period when fine, pale material accumulated along the edges of newly paved roads, drifted into doorways and collected on the flat roofs common in the city's early 19th century architecture. The substance was so light that even modest footsteps disturbed it, yet it settled in layers thick enough that shopkeepers swept it daily. The city was expanding, but not fast enough to generate this material on its own. And like Paris and St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires placed no unusual construction or weather events within the same window of time. The Southern Hemisphere example might still be explained away, if not for the pattern extending in every direction. Travellers' journals from Cairo speak of grey earth appearing in the city during years when local winds were calm and the Nile did not flood. The description is notable because Egyptians of the period were intimately familiar with silt carried by the river. They knew its colour, its smell, its texture. The material in these accounts was different, lighter, finer, almost like the residue left after a great fire, though nothing had burned. Moving westward, we find matching references in Mexico City. City maintenance logs mention unexpected build-up of sediment on public steps and plazas, described as minute earth that needed to be cleared so street vendors could operate. Curiously, the material often appeared after days of still air, contradicting every local dust transport model, and like the other cities, it accumulated in sheltered areas, inside arcades, between columns, and in the recessed stonework of civic buildings. Even distant New Zealand contributes to the pattern. Early settler diaries from the 1830s mention drifting light soil blanketing homesteads after calm nights, leaving surfaces coated in a thin, uniform layer. This occurred during years with no volcanic activity in the region, removing the most obvious explanation. Settlers noted that the dust seemed to descend rather than blow, a phrase echoed independently and accounts thousands of miles away. 3 continents now share the same impossible signatures: fine material that did not match local soil, deposition patterns inconsistent with wind, build-ups occurring without storms, arrivals noted in stillness, not turbulence. The pattern becomes clearer when we examine the timing. Most of these records fall within a span of roughly 3 decades, from the late 1790s to the early 1830s. This window overlaps with an era of global transition, political realignment and natural quiet, but not with any known environmental event capable of distributing uniform material across the world. No super eruption occurred. No global drought carried unimaginable quantities of soil into the atmosphere. No documented chain of wildfires produced enough ash to reach multiple continents in measurable layers. Yet the accumulation is unmistakable. In each location, people wrote of waking to powder that had appeared without a storm. They described drifting earth appearing where wind should not have placed it. They cleaned rooftops and courtyards as though fine sediment had fallen from the sky. When viewed individually, these accounts are quirks of local history. When viewed together, they form a coherent and troubling pattern, one that suggests a shared cause powerful enough to touch cities separated by oceans, seasons, and hemispheres. The 19th century left behind a global fingerprint, faint but consistent, a sign that something moved across the world depositing a material no one could fully identify. This worldwide alignment forces a question that the official narrative does not ask. If cities across the globe were blanketed in fine sediment during the same narrow period, then what common force reached them all? The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Something touched the entire world, and history simply turned the page as though nothing had happened. When a pattern appears across continents, across climates, and across political borders, the human instinct is to search for a single cause. Yet the 19th century dust event resists the usual answers. It was not wind, not flood, not construction, not ash, and not drought. The material that settled across the world does not trace easily to any known source. So we step carefully into the space between certainty and possibility, looking for the hidden variable that makes the contradictions align. What stands out first is the uniformity. The dust described in Paris, St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, Cairo, Mexico City, and early New Zealand, shares a remarkably similar profile, pale, fine, and unusually light. This consistency hints at origin because natural soils vary dramatically. A deposit found in Europe should not resemble one on the opposite side of the Earth, unless both came from the same larger phenomenon. The second clue lies in how the dust arrived. It fell during stillness, not storms. It collected in sheltered places, not exposed ones. It settled on rooftops and balconies, not only on the ground. These characteristics resemble sediment left behind after water recedes rather than material delivered by wind. But no flood touched all these cities. No single river could spread sediment from hemisphere to hemisphere. This leads us to consider an idea that sounds impossible when spoken plainly, yet becomes reasonable when traced through evidence. The 19th century world may have experienced a large-scale redistribution of fine earth, not horizontally across the land, but vertically through the atmosphere, or downward from a higher layer of suspended material. There is precedent for this, though faint. Some climate records reference periods of unusual atmospheric turbidity in the early 1800s, a dimming of sunlight not tied to volcanic eruption. Maritime logs mention hazy horizons over calm seas. Several astronomers documented irregularities in atmospheric clarity that lasted weeks, not enough to darken the world, but enough to suggest that fine particulate matter was lingering at high altitudes. If a layer of suspended material existed globally, even a thin one, it would not fall evenly or all at once. It would descend in waves, settling where the atmosphere cooled, where air pressure shifted, or where stillness allowed it to drift downward. Sheltered courtyards would collect more of it. Windy boulevards would collect less. Rooftops would acquire thin layers. Drainage channels would clog with fine, almost flour-like dust. The idea is not that a single event generated this material, but that something allowed pre-existing fine sediment to settle across the world in an unusual, prolonged pattern. What could cause such a condition? A global atmospheric disruption, a massive long-duration plume of particulate matter from a source not recorded clearly, a change in circulation patterns during an era when atmospheric science was still primitive and poorly documented, or perhaps something older, something left drifting from a period before the archives become reliable, finally descending during a climatic shift we no longer study. None of these possibilities require fantasy, only scale. Something introduced fine earth into the air, in quantities large enough to leave traces in multiple nations. Something held that material aloft long enough for it to disperse globally. And something caused it to fall in ways that defy ordinary weather patterns, but align perfectly with the archival record. We do not need to claim a catastrophe to see the outline of a hidden chapter. We need only accept that history often records the effects of events more reliably than the events themselves. When the world was lightly dusted with pale soil sometime between the late 1700s and early 1830s, people recorded what they saw, not what caused it. The hidden variable, then, may not be a single event at all, but a forgotten shift in the Earth's atmosphere, one that quietly redistributed a thin layer of fine earth across continents before disappearing from memory. To understand the scale of this forgotten sediment event, we turn to the physical traces it left behind, the kinds of evidence that do not bend easily to interpretation. The first category is photographs. Though photography was in its infancy in the mid-19th century, some of the earliest surviving images show cityscapes coated in a faint uniform film of light-coloured material. Early daguerreotypes from Paris and St. Petersburg capture rooftops with a powder-like brightness that is not snow, not frost, and not stone dust from construction. The exposure process of the time heightened tonal contrasts, making this material stand out in ways the human eye might have missed. These images have been catalogued as curiosities, artifacts of primitive film, yet their consistency across cities suggests otherwise. Next, we look at maps, specifically municipal engineering maps that include elevation and drainage. Cities of the early 1800s were far more sensitive to minor changes in ground level than modern ones because drainage systems were shallow and easily overwhelmed. Several European cities documented slight but measurable elevation changes in certain neighbourhoods between surveys only a few years apart. These are recorded not as natural uplift or subsidence, but as surface rise due to deposition, a phrase that appears most clearly in the 1820s. The amount was small, often only a few centimetres, but widespread enough to require the redrawing of street gradients. Then we turn to soil layers. In many older cities, redevelopment exposes cross-sections of earth that preserve forgotten chapters of urban life. Archaeologists working in Paris, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Wellington have occasionally reported thin, pale bands of sediment that do not match local soil horizons. These layers rest directly above early 19th century occupation levels, suggesting deposition at exactly the time the archival record describes. They are too thin to resemble flood sediments and too uniform to be the result of routine activity. In some places, the material appears almost sifted, as though it settled gently over time rather than arriving in a single deluge. Population math hints at the disruption as well. City labour budgets in Paris, St. Petersburg and Buenos Aires show spending spikes for street clearing in the early 1800s, spikes that exceed what would be expected from normal seasonal cleanup. Paris increased its street labourers by nearly 1/4 for several years. St. Petersburg temporarily reassigned workers from naval yards to municipal sweeping. Buenos Aires allocated emergency funds for clearing roadways so carts could pass. None of these increases correspond to storms, floods, or construction booms. Something required more hands, more tools, and more time, but no official cause was recorded. Architectural signatures also support the pattern. Many buildings constructed after the 1830s include raised thresholds, higher steps, and deeper foundations than similar buildings constructed only a decade earlier. This shift suggests that builders were compensating for something that had subtly changed the ground plane, even if the change was slight. In Paris, several churches note that their lowest steps began to sit too low during this period, prompting repairs. In St. Petersburg, drainage channels had to be deepened because their inlets were partially buried in fine sediment. Even the absence of technology becomes evidence. If this material had been generated locally, it would have required tools capable of producing enormous volumes of fine particulate matter. But the early 1800s lacked any machinery capable of grinding, pulverizing, or distributing soil on such a scale. Cities relied entirely on manual labor. No system existed that could inadvertently blanket entire districts with finely milled earth. The lack of technological capacity eliminates several modern explanations before they can even be proposed. Finally, we return to physical constraints, the kind that cannot be shaped by narrative. Fine material does not behave unpredictably. It follows known patterns, settling in predictable gradients. The 19th century deposits break those rules, appearing where they should not, remaining where they should not, and matching across continents where no connection should exist. Taken together, these forms of evidence create a picture too coherent to dismiss. We see photographs capturing unexpected brightness, maps showing slight elevation shifts, soil layers recording thin, pale bands, budgets revealing unexplained labour spikes, buildings adjusting to new ground levels, and a technological landscape incapable of producing the material found. At some point, the accumulation of clues becomes harder to ignore than the event itself. Something deposited a thin layer of fine earth across the world, quietly, steadily, and without explanation. When we gather all these threads, a single realization begins to take shape. Quiet at first, then impossible to set aside. Cities across multiple continents documented the same pale material. It arrived in the same narrow frame of time. It settled in ways that contradict wind, water, and weather. It appears in soil layers, in budget ledgers, in engineering maps, in early photographs, and in the architectural adjustments of an era that did not understand why its thresholds were slowly disappearing beneath a rising veil of dust. None of these records claim certainty. None attempt to explain the cause. They simply describe what they saw, and then history moved on. And perhaps that is where the most unsettling fracture lies, not in the phenomenon itself, but in how easily it vanished from memory. An event large enough to affect cities on opposite sides of the world left no collective account, no debate, no record of fear or wonder. It slipped into the archives quietly, as if the people living through it recognized something we no longer understand. This silence asks a question more profound than any single explanation could offer. If the 19th century world was lightly buried in fine earth, then what mechanism could have operated on a scale vast enough to touch Europe, South America, Africa, and the Pacific within decades? Was it a shift in the atmosphere, a long-forgotten climatic disturbance, or the final settling of something older than the century itself? And if such a phenomenon occurred once, what else might have happened that left traces we no longer recognise as clues? We are left staring at an era that looks stable only because we inherited the most convenient version of it. The dust is gone, the sediment has been swept away, and the cities it touched grew over the residue, leaving us with a thin line in the soil and a few perplexing sentences in municipal logs. So the question lingers, soft and heavy, as persistent as the dust itself. If this chapter of the world could disappear so easily, what other parts of our history have settled quietly into the ground, unnoticed and unexamined? In the end, what remains is not an answer, but a faint impression, like the trace of a footprint long after the traveller has passed. The early 19th century left us cities rising from a thin veil of earth, a world quietly coated in material that should not have been there, yet was swept away without ceremony. The event did not shape wars or redraw borders, but it altered the physical world in small, steady ways, enough to leave signatures that only become visible when viewed across centuries. There is something profoundly human in how the story unfolds. People saw the dust, cleared it from their steps, swept it from their roofs, dug it out of their drainage channels, then continued with their lives. They did not imagine they were living through an anomaly that would puzzle us 200 years later. They faced an unexplained world with the calm acceptance of those accustomed to forces beyond their control. And perhaps that is why this forgotten chapter carries its own strange beauty. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by monumental events, but also by quiet disturbances that ripple beneath awareness. Not every mystery announces itself. Some settle softly, leaving thin layers of evidence that speak only when the pieces are finally assembled. We walk today on streets built over those pale deposits. We live in cities shaped subtly by their presence. We inherit a world where the past rests in thin, nearly invisible layers that ask questions without offering conclusions. If you seek forgotten stories like this, consider subscribing. There are many more chapters buried just below the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And as we close this investigation, one quiet thought remains, drifting like the dust that once covered the world. How much of our history lies not in what we remember, but in what we never realized we saw at all?